Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology. And with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. While philosophy is an important part of both life's big and small questions, in many cases, the latter are influenced by the former. And when it comes to big questions, there are few bigger than those concerning spirituality and religion. Today we'll look at both and attempt to parse apart their differences, hopefully providing insight into the roles they play in our lives. All right, so this episode sort of springs from an assignment I had for school, and I can't go into specific results of that assignment. It was part of the rules of conducting it, but in very broad general strokes, I had to perform a study that looked at human spirituality, right? And it was a great experience. It was the first time in my life where I realized that I have the intellectual toolbox now to conduct research and do things at a high level. But it provided a lot of interesting insights, and you and I had a lot of sort of satellite discussions about it. And we thought, this would be a good podcast episode. And even today, I think we just talked for over an hour about it before the show even started.
Warming up.
So let's start with just the basic question. What does it mean to be spiritual?
We'll say, as we often do, we'll do the disclaimer. I don't get to sit here and make the ultimate definition of it. None of us, you're not trying to, I'm not trying to. So to me, I go with a standard definition as a start. The quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. So if you're talking about spirit, which we can't really describe adequately, although poetry does it wonderfully, we intuit. We can't use our five senses in any profoundly specific or empirical way to talk about these things. So we have to not abandon that, but acknowledge that up front. And so to me, I guess partly when we talk about anything spiritual, I'm talking about that which shifts the conversation to the arcane, the unseeable, unknowable, and which doesn't mean we stop the conversation. It means we go with the conversation, but shifting to the things that aren't material, or talking about how things that are material step us up into. And there's a metaphor, and I just want to toss it out and then go. But listen, when we say step up, when I said step up, the vertical metaphor is almost always present because we privilege somehow that spiritual thing.
That's the interesting sort of irony of it, right? Is that we say that when we're talking about spiritual or about the spirit of the soul, that we're going beyond the five senses. But at the same time, it almost seems as if the spirit or the soul is what we consider as the thing that unites the five senses. It's what stops us from just being these creatures that are, engaging in things. What separates us from the animals in some regard, right? There's something else going on that is in uniting all of this, which unity is the conversation we had last week.
Exactly so.
It's taking these individual parts and it's creating something cohesive out of them. So at one point, we're going beyond this physical realm, but at the other point, it almost seems as if it's uniting the physical realm for our perceptions in some regard. So
interesting. Okay.
It's an interesting topic. Like you said, we're going to be out in left field on this one a little bit because the spirit and the soul is something that is outside of the realm of strictly empirical science.
Right. It is, and philosophers readily acknowledge this when they talk about religion or spirituality. And part of what we've talked about is, I think at one point we're saying religiosity versus spirituality. And so, and religiosity would be a kind of talking about the embrace of structures that we think are formally intended in an ideological way to take us toward matters of spirituality, but there are many who say, well, I don't need all the structures of religiosity to do that. There are other ways to get there.
Are there other ways you think religion is juxtaposed to spirituality, or what should we say about religion?
Well, again, this is one person speaking who has about the broadest spectrum of people in his life, my life, who run the range from complete and beautiful atheism to absolutely committed Catholicism. And the marvelous thing about experiencing all of these people, and you and I run along that spectrum, is to hear what they think or feel. Because often it has to be feel. We can think about religion, of course. We can think about it from a viewpoint of structure. I think, as A.C. Grayling does, that religion has had a more profoundly negative than positive effect in the world. That's where I am. I to look at it in material world circumstances, the depredations that have been done in the name of all kinds of religiosity are profound in themselves. So I'm not bashing anyone who's listening, saying, well, if you have a religious inclination, or if you have a faith, then I think less of you. And no, doesn't matter what I think anyway. But for me, looking at the world, reading of the world, walking in the world, the effects are profoundly damaging.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part of it, is that I think anybody who's listened to us for a while, it's just sort of human nature to sort of, associate, try to have some insight into personal beliefs and that sort of thing. And I'm guessing, based off of our previous discussions, a lot of people would think, okay, well, this episode is going to be doing a lot of sort of bashing of religion or spirituality. We're not going to do that. We were talking about it before the show, and we've talked about it previously. There's no way really of disproving God or, these spiritual or religious notions. Like we just said, they're outside of the realm of science. So we can't prove them. We can't disprove them. All we can do is question what the reasonableness is, what the utility is, what sort of things are happening. So we're approaching this discussion from that viewpoint. Okay, if we look at it, regardless of what we believe, if we ask some of these basic questions, what answers do we get back based off of the evidence that there is, whether it be anecdotal or theoretical?
That's the philosophical approach. The philosophy, when you're talking about religion or spirituality, you're trying to find ways to assess the likelihood of the belief, or the falsehood of it, or the truth within the belief, but assessing it through philosophical terms, not proving, just assessing what it leads to or what it might mean.
Right. Yeah, I think that I've used the example in the past, right? If we sat here, right, and I said, for instance, that the Christian worldview is bunk, right? And I could point out all kinds of evidence, right, for an old earth or for this or that or the other thing. But the fact remains that if there is a God, he very well could have planted dinosaur fossils. He very well could have taken the starlight that's billions of light years away and somehow stretched it to arrive at us, in 6,000 years. If there is a God who's omniscient and omnipotent in these things, he could theoretically do these things. And I could be very, very wrong in that assumption, right? But the likelihood or the logic behind all of these things are going in. So
the implication of the why would one do that?
Right. Yeah. So again, just as a preface, before we get too far into the discussion, just want to let everybody know, like you said, we're not bashing anybody who has religious beliefs, because it would be very ignorant of us to do so, because at the core, we are ignorant of religious and spiritual things. We are just postulating, right? We're asking questions, we're probing, but don't expect us to give you any hard answers on where these things are, where they're going. Do you think you can be religious without a conception of God?
I think you can be spiritual without a conception of God. I think the very nature of religion is a structure of rules, regulations, behaviors, approaches to getting closer to God, or a set of gods, but something definably pantheistic or monotheistic, whereas spirituality is not focused on necessarily a larger being of some kind.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that probably the linchpin in that conversation would be Buddhism, right? Because a lot of these, it's one of the major quote unquote religions that doesn't really have a God per se. And lots of people debate back and forth whether it's a religion or a philosophy. Mm-hmm. Would probably be on the side of it being a philosophy, because there isn't a God associated with it. So it's more spiritual in nature than religious. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, you studied religion, so you think that having a deity is really an integral part of having a religion.
I haven't found. Okay, in my limited experience, I haven't encountered a religion that is practiced in authentic ways that doesn't have that at its core. This is why we separate religions from the twisted variant called cults. Because you can have a cult of personality with a human being who's raised to a demagogic status. But a religion, now, and indigenous cultures across the planet have primarily, I think probably universally, spiritual cultures. And in our own history, we know to be very utterly simplistic. The Christian religion, proponents of the Christian religion, representatives of various sects of the Christian religion, did all they could possibly do to subsume, crack, destroy, negate native, indigenous religious systems, and trying therefore to break the spirituality, which you really cannot do. And it wasn't uniformly successful at all. That we know that, but it was one of those acts that a formal religion enacted upon other religions.
So, yeah, I guess the next natural question would be, what what constitutes a religion,
Mhm.
right? So let's say, I think, I remember you telling me one time, when you were younger, you went to a church, right?
Yes.
Where, you were singing hymns about evolution and these sorts of things, right?
Yes.
So this church that you were going to, there was no God, I'm assuming, right?
Oh, well,
But
no,
you
actually there is.
Oh, there is. Okay.
Oh, yeah. This is the Unitarian Church. And the Unitarian Church, this was a Unitarian, one church in the Unitarian religion. But Unitarians, it's a religious denomination. God is only one person. God is not a triumvirate.
Okay.
But within that, they don't. There's no idea of original sin. There's no eternal punishment for sins committed on the earth, and so it's much more of a here, present, now focus of God and relationship with God. And why wouldn't evolution be a relationship with God? Because evolution is so. Whatever you essentially, whatever you find through human knowledge, which is in those terms, the brain that God gave you,
Right.
then that must be worthy of.
Gotcha. Okay.
God.
All right, that's good information. It ruined my thought experiment, but good. All right, so we'll go back. We'll go back then. So let me pose this to you. Let's say there is an institution, right? They have a building. They have a structure for collecting money to support the institution. They have, regimented sort of doctrine or theology about what it means to live a good life, to do these things. People gather, they do all this stuff. But there is no deity. Is that a religion?
Formalistically, yes. And one could make the case that has been done many times to bilk people out of money by people who didn't believe in what they were putting up as the focus of their religion. Anyway, there's a marvelous line in a movie called Bull Durham. Bull Durham is a baseball movie. Kevin Costner, Susan Sarandon. He's an older ball player from the Bush leagues, but she's a constant fan. But what she talks about is the religion of baseball. That why it is a religion for some people, or you could transfer that to religion of football. Is that some people talk about the religion of shopping, where you go through. I mean, think about it. You go into a building that has a commonly recognized shape, a commonly recognized iconic symbol. You walk through the doors. You are welcomed. You are hoping to find that thing which is going to make you feel better or make the day work better. You give something of yourself to do that, something of your resources to do that. You get something in return, and for a moment, the day is better.
Yeah, and that's even talked about in more formal, organized religions. They talk about having the god of money, right? And how you shouldn't do that sort of thing.
We talked about the economy as that kind of thing, right?
So I guess we're still trying to come to an agreement on what a religion is. We said that a God is needed, but then if we remove God and put the structures in place, it's still sort.
It looks like a religion.
Still,
that would be
what would it be?
That would be a faux religion, a pseudo religion, a cult. It has the mechanism or the practice, but nothing at the center. I mean, usually. Universally, religion is talked about in terms of the worship of the structured behaviors and institutionalization of patterns, laws, rules, and approaches to worship something superhuman.
Yeah. So I guess is there another term? We know that a cult. I think a cult might.
Well,
what defines that? Do you think that revolves around a human being holding the place of God, or could we define it as a different concept, like we were just talking about, the god of money, right? Would that be a cult, or is there a different term that we haven't brought into the conversation yet?
A system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object.
Okay,
we have the cult of Donald Trump. That's talked about frequently in political terms. It's political religion. The things that aren't supposed to go together, but they do. Any obsessive focus on a veneration of an individual, as opposed to now this is modern in current terms. There was the cult of Demeter in Greece, which was fascinating. It's the worship of Demeter by all means possible through a very structured set of practices. But it's called a cult because it focused on that one figure. And there wasn't a monotheistic God in the Greek pantheon. It's a pantheon, right? So there are those who speak of some practices by some Catholic sects. Catholicism is a sect, but then we can break it down to smaller. That if they worship a saint, then, and not in derogatory terms, that would become a cult. So a cult is a system of veneration, a relatively small group of people behaving with religious practice. We use it in the negative sense of connotation of obsessive, the cult of whatever particular terrorist or the misreading of the postulations, the rules, regulations of a religion get twisted, obsessified. That's not a word. I just made that up. and thus shaped into something that perhaps wasn't originally intended.
Yeah. So that's fascinating, right? What separates a religion from a cult is the object of worship. And in religion, we're assuming that it's a supernatural God. And in a cult, it's focused on either a naturalistic person or a conception or an idea that is not
everything else.
Yeah, that is not this supernatural God. Then that it looks like, based off of sort of the thought scenarios that we played out and the descriptions that we read, it seems like that might be the only difference.
Yeah, it is, and this negative connotation that's applied to it. I don't know if we're straying off from the topic or not. How can we not? The negative connotations are often applied specifically for social manipulation. Because you use the word cult, and you ask anybody just on the street, and that negative association is there. Unless it's a cult focused on something that people really, fanatic is often associated with the idea of cult. And to be fanatic is to be obsessively, I suppose people could say I'm a fanatic about Marvel, but no, Marvel's not a cult. I enjoy the stories. I'm not a fan in the sense that I don't believe, this isn't what's a ritualistic thing. That's to say, well, it is. It is.
Well, see,
a new movie comes out and you go to it and okay.
That's where it gets interesting, right? Is because like you were just mentioning, there's this overwhelming negative connotation with it. And I think that probably stems from unhealthy behaviors that develop from people who do get to a certain level of obsession, or who have followed a figurehead or an idea that led them into negative behaviors. But do you think that religious sort of fervor dedicated to the right sort of goals is an unhealthy? Do you think that religious dedication is always an unhealthy behavior?
No, I don't think that religious.
Because in that case, right, like if you're a fanatic, a Marvel fanatic, right?
Yeah.
As long as you're not spending so money that you don't have to buy action figures, or you're not spending all of your time away from your family at movies, or you're doing,
right.
But you have some sort of reverence, right, for the concepts or the lessons that are being taught or these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Is it unnecessary? Do we have to get defensive about it? Do we have to consider it a negative thing?
No, I don't think so. And I certainly don't think that people with religious dedication, I'm going to step carefully. I'm thinking this is an excellent question. Are automatically bad. I think that any religion, this is me, okay, I'm not speaking for anything but me, any religious dedication that denies, downplays, or tries to destroy or remove the human rights, the humanistic element, the human rights of any other person. That's where it's damaging. That's where it goes into moral wrongness. That's where it's unethical.
Right. And it's pretty plain to see how there are certain ideas or certain human figureheads in a cult setting that could lead you to that conclusion. I think what's more difficult for people to see is that, for some people, I should say, is that happens in a religious context, right? Because I think that this idea of God, of having the supernatural figurehead, it takes that responsibility out of the member's hands, right? You're suddenly allowed to have positions and ideas and commit actions that would be morally reprehensible because there's a figure beyond humanity that is said to have a certain set of values that you ascribe to, right? But yeah, it's fascinating. I think that we need another word. We need a word that has a positive connotation that still talks about cult, a positive connotation of cult, right? Because I think that there might be some healthy behaviors that are associated with. I mean, I think about myself, right? I probably have a religious fervor for learning, right? And you know, I pursue a lot of different things, and do I get carried away? Sometimes, but I can always come back to, you know, it just seems like the behavior in itself doesn't necessarily seem to be negative in a way that the word cult or fanatic has the constant negativity surrounded to it.
The thesaurus suggests that agnostic is the antonym of cultish.
Interesting.
It is interesting. I just did a quick glance. I think discipline, any tradition, any spiritual tradition that I've read of or encountered in whatever ways, in some ways has that element, the necessary element of discipline, of practice. Where it becomes potentially dangerous is if the practice is so normalized that no thought is going into it. I practice yoga. I have for a long time. I practice inconsistently in the sense that I constantly find myself going into running into things that are called in the practice samskara. Samskara has a double meaning. It can mean a rut, a point that one needs to remove oneself from, or a good practice, something that has become internalized. But in the negative connotation of samskara, as I've come to understand it, you just are doing the same thing and doing the same thing without giving attention to it. Well, I one of my friends who's a pastor, and I've been fortunate, given who I am, to have more than one, often did his homilies on the idea of if you always do what you always did, you always are going to get what you always got. Well, my father used to say the same kind of thing, but ultimately it's true. If you don't think, reassess, ask the questions about where the practice is leading and why the practice is being done this way, and could it be done differently, and then it is meaningless, except perhaps for whatever physical development you can do.
Yeah, I think that the discipline and the mindfulness portion of it is important, because I think that the reason cult and fanaticism has an overwhelmingly universal, almost negative connotation is because it violates a basic principle of living a good life, which is moderation in all things, right? Religious fervor requires you to go beyond moderation. It requires you to have an immersive, obsessive experience. And that can easily become a negative thing if you aren't being disciplined in the practice and being mindful of where you're going.
This is why that's excellently said. And this is why fundamentalism is a word that crosses not only discussions about certain brands or varieties of religion, but also the political result of such things. There's this phrase that is often used of giving yourself to God, whatever people think that means. But if in giving yourself to God, you are, and I've heard pastors discuss this too, as well as philosophy instructors, if that means it's all up to God, then what you're saying is I am an automaton, a materialized figure for carrying out whatever God tells me to do. Okay, we all have voices in our heads. And if you are reading your particular sacred text and thinking about your practice, and that leads you to deeper and deeper calmness or positive engagement with the world, then I think you could say that kind of discipline is working. But if in giving yourself to God or a God, you are relinquishing any responsibility for your act, saying, well, this is what God intended me to do and I must do this, then that can lead you down other paths that aren't so
right. And I think that
healthy.
There's probably, maybe not in our listener group, but worldwide, if people were listening to this podcast, I think there'd probably be about 50% of people that would say that giving yourself to God is a good thing because you're doing something greater than yourself. You're giving yourself something greater than yourself. And there's 50% of people that would say you're crazy, right?
Probably.
So I think that raises the question, if we're looking, again, coming back to religion and spirituality, and looking at the driving force behind them, do you think that the driving force behind them is this search for something that's greater than us? Or do you think that spiritual or religious beliefs can exist within the context of just the human being without anything else?
The spiritual context, yes. Perhaps the religious context. I'm trying to begin to say this carefully. I'm trying to pull together years and years of, and I've thought about our discussion. It's not like a willy-nilly off the top of the head, but there's so many discussions and readings involved in this. A figure like Mother Teresa, pretty iconic and therefore recognizable, who stunned people with the revelation when they found out that Mother Teresa said she had never heard the voice of God. Was Mother Teresa an incredible figure of Catholic practice or religious let's remove the, I can't think you can remove the Catholic, but religious practice. Yes. Did she try to do what we would call social good? I think that's arguably yes, but it's a very complicated story, and not everyone, it didn't turn out well for everybody. But the fact that people can do a religious practice without ever encountering a directness from God, and somebody at that level who everybody thinks that they recognize, tells me that there's still ultimately the human element, ultimately the human act of helping other people can be read as godly, or can be read as, of course, this is what we do as human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. You and I were talking about before the show about how your son, who's been on the show and talked about villains, was saying that we need to get past Darth Vader syndrome, which is this idea of somebody doing one good thing after a lifetime of evil and being redeemed. And it takes me back to being about 6 or 7 years old and in Sunday school. And I had this old crotchety teacher with like this crazy gray hair. But he's a good guy, and I remember asking him, at that age, I said, well, Bob, if there's a really nice old lady that never believes in God, but she does the right thing her whole life and she dies, does she go to hell? And if somebody is a terrible person their whole life and then they accept Jesus at the end, do they go to heaven? And he said, yeah. He said, but I think that there's different levels. He said, maybe the little old lady, just has a little bit of fire at her feet and it's comfortable, right? He's talking to a 7-year-old. So, he's trying to, he said, maybe it's a comfortable place, but she's eternally separated from God. Whereas this other guy that did these terrible things, he came to know the truth at the end. So he gets to go to some level of heaven. To me, that's a very interesting thought.
It is.
Behind religion, right? Is this idea that just the belief in the supernatural deity is enough to separate you from one place or the other.
But there are some and it's very interesting, but there's some Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
If you're not sure, well, you might as well just say that you believe, because maybe better things will happen. I think there are a lot of branches of Christian, Muslim practice. I probably out of the big three in the Western context, that would say, nah, it's got to be more than just saying, yeah, count me in.
Right.
But it is this redemption thing that is so much part of the narrative. And I'm not making light of it by calling it the redemption thing. Can a person be redeemed? Well, the sacred texts are filled with stories of people who did horrific things, murdered people and so on, but ultimately saw the light and changed the practice of their lives. Well, I think people can change the practice of their lives, of course. I think that the idea of a scale of balance, such as you might get in some other Egyptian iconography, is just a little too, I don't want to say cute, but a little too human serving. Because you can't get away from human iconography, because how else are we going to, the human mind and heart are going to try to interpret these things. So yeah, did I do enough good stuff that the bad stuff is balanced out? If I'm in balance, then I get to go to the field of reeds. If not, then I'm going to be doomed the way any particular religion likes to doom people. That doesn't work for me. I personally, because there's just a small amount of life, and eternity is forever.
Yeah, it creates an interesting context for this question, though, of the driving force behind spiritual or religious beliefs.
Yeah.
Because if there was no hell, right? you could make, like with Pascal's wager, right? You could make the argument that hell is a driving force for religious affiliation.
Yeah.
Which, an interesting tidbit is that hell itself isn't even really mentioned in the Old Testament.
Oh.
And
biblical scholars, Cambridge and so on, I know the intellectual elite, the committed Christian scholars who have traced hell back to Gehenna, which is a place where trash was always burning far outside the city of Jerusalem, and bodies were taken there too. And that gets transferred into the symbol system.
Right.
Now, that's one explanation, but it works for me because humans do all kinds of things with words. So yeah, if the motivation is fear, I don't like anything that motivates people by fear.
So if we're looking at it, right?
Yeah.
Does spirituality and religion have the same driving forces behind them?
Well, let's take off the driving forces. If the driving force is an emotion such as fear, I suppose so. Although I think it would be hard to be spiritual if you were always looking over your shoulder to see if you were balancing those scales.
Yeah, my inclination would be that if they share a driving force, it would be that there's something greater than the material self. I think that, and again, this is, not off the cuff. I've thought about it a lot, but in this moment, that's really the one thing that I think would unify the two concepts, right? That they would share in common as a driving force would be that spiritual beliefs or the various types of religious beliefs all seem to have in common the hope, at least, and the belief at most that there is something greater than just my physical body here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And humanistically, I think I have to say that while it would be, and if there's something beyond this, I'm either going to see it or not. I can't belabor myself now with what there's enough to take care of now. But if we have experiences internally that make us think and feel freshly, I think that in itself can be spiritual, whether there's any organized set of next steps and principles beyond one life.
Yeah. You and I were talking about this before the show, just various experiences that we don't have the scientific instrumentation to really study, but we have enough sort of anecdotal evidence to know that there's something to. And the ones we were specifically talking about before the show were near-death experiences or psychedelic experiences, these sort of fascinating psychological instances of people achieving this sort of perspective or insight that allows them to what they believe leads them outside of their physical body, right?
Yeah.
And it really is just a fascinating sort of topic. Do you think that that's where spiritual and religious beliefs originally came from? Is these kind of experiences?
That's an interesting question. I think that they perhaps contribute to it, but there are plenty of people who've been near death and haven't had, I have to say that too. If one were going to count that as the measure, then there are a lot of people who, then there's nothing after. And I think, okay, all right, really, we're going to go into this abacus of, oh, you're over here and you're over here, because that's, why not? That's the way we spend our entire lives, politically, socially, and everything else. You either belong or you don't belong. You're going to go here or you're going to go there. I know that because I'm telling you that because, I think that the personal experience, going to your question, is what leads to the potential for the real engagement with religion or engagement with the spiritual, whatever one conceives the spiritual to be, because ultimately that is going to be personal. We can tell each other through poetry, through painting, through music, through dialogue, what the spiritual is like. But we can't tell each other what the spiritual is.
Yeah. And again, this touches on, parts of the previous conversation where we were talking about how, religious fervor violates that basic human sort of assumption that things are good in moderation, right? Religious fervor requires you to delve into something immersively. And you really can't have good music or good art or good poetry if you don't do that thing. And that's why there is sort of a positive, it's not always negative. But when we think about how these things emerged originally, right? How did spiritual beliefs arise in ancient times? How did religion arise in ancient times, right? Do you think it comes from a dream, or eating the wrong type of berries or mushrooms, or having? Where do you think that these sorts of experiences or beliefs?
All of the above, my friend. I don't think that there is one origin story, and I think, and my basis for that is all of the origin stories for the human species itself across the planet, in indigenous cultures and across the world. There are as many creation stories, cosmological stories, and generation stories as there are cultures. And I think the same is true for the spiritual experience. For some, perhaps the help to get there. For some, the dream. For some, the looking at the world and saying, it just must mean something. And we talked about meaning in one of our episodes, and I think many of us have had a moment in nature. We're always in nature, by the way. We're not in nature, but we've had a moment where we've looked at the stars or listened to the water, or whatever it happens to be, and there's just this bigger thing that I'm part of, this planet. That's spiritual enough. Maybe there's even more, but wow.
Yeah, and that's where philosophy is interesting, right? Is that some people have a religious fervor for science, right? That's kind of the be all end all. But if you look at the world, right, and like you just said, every part of the world has creation stories. It's very unlikely that one creation story developed with the first humans, and then as they spread out, it just sort of adapted and everybody had their own. It's much more likely that people throughout the world independently developed creation stories, right? Or religious beliefs, or and like we were talking about, these these experiences beyond yourself, whether it's just engaging in mindfulness, yoga practices, or ingesting the wrong substance, or having a crazy dream or something. But it's sort of a shared experience worldwide that sort of developed independently, right?
Yeah.
And so even if you don't have a way of scientifically analyzing or measuring this sort of thing, it makes you go, right? Kind of like when scientists keep seeing that things keep evolving into crabs, right? Well, why does that keep happening, right? It just
watch me in 20 years.
It stokes this curiosity, right? So I think that, it raises a few interesting questions. I think that for religion, one would be, do you think the rise of religion is just a way of bringing consistency and community to spiritual beliefs?
I think it's an excellent question. I think the way of the rise of religion, the consistency part, yes. The community part, some. But that depends upon how the religious structure, the architecture, so to speak, metaphorically, as well as literally, but the metaphorical architecture of the religion as it accrues, as it grows, as all things in capitalism do, as it just gets more and more complicated, that excises other people. Well, we create a community, but only if you believe what you're supposed to believe. Can you be in that community? Or at least everyone's sort of pretending to believe what they're supposed to believe so they really can have community. You see, and I think that happens too. I think there are a lot of people who are, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but are playing the game in a sense so that they can feel a belonging and have help when they can't get things accomplished themselves. Religion is a social safety net for many people, and thus a social service that I think governments like to stroke, because then it means the government has to spend less money on some social services, and that can create messiness, and that can create exclusivity. Those are the downsides that I see. The upside is, sure, there's a community. I had an experience with my young family when they met incredibly interestingly kind and decent people beyond their immediate family. Elder people of middle age who were interested in them, and I will be forever grateful for that. But at the same time, the moment you examine what the beliefs were required to be according to the principles of the church, righteously, I should have walked out the door, and eventually did. And not because of the people, but because of what one was required to believe if one was going to belong in a formal sense to the church. And these were anathema to my sense of social justice and equality for people. And so, there's the community level, and this is not for all situations, but there's the community level, and then there's the formal rules practice, where the exclusivity begins to happen, where the pressure begins to happen. Well, you must believe this if you're going to stay with us. Must I? Okay. That takes us back to the United, by the way. If I get to be part of the United States, what is it that I must believe? If I'm going to be part of X religion, what is it that I must believe? I think that's where it intrudes in the spiritual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or can. Not necessarily, but can.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that, again, looking at a consistency in community, I think of, there's almost another word for community. It's tribe, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, tribalism has a negative connotation. Community has a positive one, right? But it's sort of two sides of the same coin. And spiritual beliefs, right? Spirituality does not require the community element.
No.
And yeah, that.
I took us into a corner, didn't I?
Well, we're getting towards the end anyways. But no, it's just, again, still trying to, looking at these things, parsing them apart, and thinking about, to me, it always comes back to the initial motivators, right? Those are the things that are interesting. What is the prime mover of these things, right?
Right.
And yeah. I think with a lot of human development, the prime motivator is something that has to do with community, something that has to do with tribalism. That's sort of the development. That's the hallmark of our species, is this ability to work together, to cooperate, to form groups, which leads to both positive and negative consequences. But spirituality is something that it can exist outside of that. And it seems to be it seems to be a very high level cognitive pursuit to exist individually, right? Religion, right? That takes a lot of effort to establish a doctrine and establish customs and practices and to do these things and to keep everybody, like you said, and to monitor these beliefs. Spiritualism is something that's going to vary from person to person, but there are things that remain consistent across people, and really what we said earlier, it's probably this drive to believe that there's something greater than just our material self.
This is, I will end my part with this and let you finish, but this is why I won't say the religious fervor of the science. Science is, and I totally take the meaning that you had used earlier. Science is not a religion, because science, unless it gets perverted in a sense, because science does not have the answers, or all of them seeks them. Science does not start from the position of this is what you must believe. Science starts with these are the things that we can empirically present. Now, where does that lead us? Religion starts with this is so, and therefore you can't be part unless you accept this. And so there's a difference there, and that's why I think that people in a religious community find their own spirituality independent, as you said, sometimes independent of the religious structure, or in spite of the religious structure, because something in them rebels at the enormity of the ideological requirement and says, no, I don't have to believe that in order to develop whatever this thing is that's my soul.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. And just, I know that we're gonna talk about this again as we come up with things, because I have questions still going through my mind, thinking about, well, where does that impetus arise from, right? Where does that individual
why do we intuit that something's there? Why do we want to believe something is there? Yeah. Is it as simple as we just don't want to accept that in X number of years we're done?
Yeah, and I guess that would be, that would be sort of the prime question, right? Is that is our spiritual ideations unique to human consciousness? I would assume probably so. And now, that raises the question, is the knowledge of death the impetus for spiritual and religious ideations, right? We don't know, but it seems unlikely that other animals are aware of their impending death. Humans are, right? And I think that knowledge, that insight, very well could be part of that.
There's a whole branch of religious studies, of the study of religion, it's called eschatology. Eschatology is the study of how different groups of people, how different religions, how different belief systems, what do they set up toward the idea of death? What are the practices, the traditions, the procedures, therefore the assumptions?
Yeah, and I've read some interesting ones, and this is something that's not uniform from religion to religion. There's some practices around death that would be abhorrent to a Western observer. But yeah, it again, as we always do, we've raised more questions than we have answers. But that's what gives us, fuel for our future conversations as we continue to tie things in and make new pathways into philosophical discussions. So until next time, keep pondering.